Take your hands off her. 3 flat, quiet words on a dusty porch. And Reuben Whitlock would never guess the ragged stranger at the well was her own brother, a ghost she'd buried in her heart 12 years back, and the deadliest gun west of the Pecos besides. Nobody in that yard could have guessed it. We're about to learn what happens when a man with nothing left to lose finds out he still has one thing left to protect. Before we get to the part where the Whitlock name stopped meaning anything in that country, let me set the year and the ground it happened on, because a story like this deserves telling right from the beginning. If you're riding along tonight, drop where you're listening from in the comments. I do love picturing the map light up with all of you scattered across the dark, sharing a fire with an old man and his memory. Now, let's go back to a spring that came late to the New Mexico territory in the year 1884, back to a spread of land outside Silver City where a widow's spring was about to become the reason for more blood than anyone in 3 counties had spent in a decade. The territory in those days was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. Silver City itself sat in a bowl of hills gone red and orange with ore dust, a boomtown built on the backs of men who dug copper and silver out of the ground and drank away what they earned before the week was out. But 10 miles south, where the land flattened into scrub grass and mesquite, there was quieter country, the kind of country where a woman could raise a boy alone if she was stubborn enough and the water held. Roselyn Cade was 26 years old that spring, and she had buried a husband 3 winters back, a quiet man named Daniel Cade who had ridden dispatch for the Confederacy as a boy and carried the cough that killed him all the way from a Tennessee prison camp, where he'd hoped the dry air might save what the damp had started to ruin. It hadn't. Roselyn had watched him go the way you watch a candle burn down, pass the wick slow, and then all at once, and she had been left with a boy not yet 5, a scrap of deeded land, and one thing of real value in that whole dry country, a spring. It wasn't much to look at, a pool of clear water pushing up out of limestone at the base of a low ridge, feeding a stand of cottonwoods that were the only green for 2 miles in any direction. But in a country where most wells ran brackish or dry by August, Cade's Spring, as the old maps called it, though nobody used the name out loud anymore, never once failed. It ran cold and sweet in July, same as January, and it ran under Roselyn's 160 acres, which she held clear title to under her late husband's name, filed proper at the land office in Silver City the year they'd settled. She had a boy to raise a garden that fought the caliche soil every season, and mostly won, 4 milk goats, and a spring that made her without her ever asking, because the Whitlock Ranch was thirsty. Ezra Whitlock had built the biggest spread in that stretch of the territory over 20 years of grabbing land the way a drowning man grabs driftwood, never quite legal, never quite provable, always just inside the shadow of the law he'd bought and paid for. He ran near 4,000 head of cattle on range that had once belonged to a dozen small outfits, most of which had gone under or been run off in the years since Ezra arrived with money nobody could account for. His wells were failing. 2 summers of thin rain had turned half his tanks to mud, and the cattle were dying slow, bawling deaths out on the flats, and Ezra Whitlock had looked at the map of his failing empire and seen, sitting square in the middle of the one piece of ground he didn't own, a spring that never ran dry. He wanted it. And Ezra Whitlock was not a man built to want something without eventually simply taking it. He had 3 sons, and the territory had a saying about the Whitlock boys, one that got repeated in the saloons and at the mercantile counter with a shake of the head. God gave that family every vice a man could carry, and split it 3 ways so each boy could specialize. Reuben, the eldest at 31, had inherited his father's temper without his father's patience, a man who solved problems with his fists first, and his brain never, the kind of man who'd once beaten a stable hand half to death. Cletus, 28, ran the family's other business, the one Ezra didn't discuss at the supper table, moving stolen cattle and unmarked copper ore through a network of crooked buyers clear to El Paso, a man whose easy smile hid a mind that never stopped calculating an angle. And Vern, the youngest at 24, had a taste for whiskey and other men's wives that had already gotten one husband shot dead in a dispute nobody in town would talk about above a whisper. 3 sons, 3 vices, one father's greed holding the whole rotten arrangement together. And in the spring of 1884, all 4 of them had turned their attention to a widow's spring. Ezra had sent an offer first, a fair enough number on paper, delivered by Cletus with his easy smile, for the 160 acres and the water that came with it. Roselyn's answer was no. Polite, the way a woman learns to refuse powerful men when she has a son to protect and no husband to stand behind her, but no all the same, and Cletus had ridden back to the ranch with his smile gone thin at the edges. Ezra had sent a second offer, lower than the first, which any fool could read as a message: refuse us and the price only drops. Roselyn's answer was the same. Her boy, Samuel, was 4 years old, and she had promised his father on his deathbed that she would keep the land whole for the child, and a woman who has made a promise like that to a dying man does not sell it away for Whitlock money, not for any number they cared to write on paper. So Ezra had stopped sending offers. That particular morning, the last week of April, Reuben and Vern had ridden on to Roselyn's land with a wagon and a deed already drawn up by the family's tame lawyer in town. A document that needed only her signature to transfer the 160 acres, and they had not come to ask politely. Roselyn had been at her wash line when she heard the horses, had turned to find Reuben already off his mount and coming across the yard with a deed in one hand and no patience left in him at all. Mourning Widow Cade. There wasn't a lick of morning courtesy in how Reuben spat it out. My father's grown tired of asking nice. You're going to sign this deed today, or Vern here is going to have himself a conversation with that boy of yours about what happens to fatherless children who don't mind their manners. Roselyn had gone cold clean through the way only a mother threatened through her child can go cold, and she had told him, steady as she could manage with her heart going like a rabbit's, that she would sign nothing, that the land was her son's inheritance and no Whitlock offer, however dressed up as a courtesy. And Reuben Whitlock, a man who had never once in his life accepted a woman's no as final, had grabbed her wrist and started dragging her toward the wagon, meaning to haul her into Silver City himself and stand over her until a notary put ink to the paper whether she willed it or not. While Vern laughed from the saddle and little Samuel screamed from the doorway of the house, too small to do anything but scream. That was the yard the drifter rode into. He had come up from the south 3 days prior, a man who gave his name to no one, paid the livery in Silver City, with dust weighed out of a worn leather poke, and took a room above the mercantile without explaining himself to the clerk who'd asked. He was tall in the particular way that made men in a room stand up a little straighter without knowing why, somewhere near 35, with a face gone the color of old saddle leather from more sun than any one life ought to hold, and pale gray eyes that seemed to be looking at something. He wore a duster, the color of dust itself, a hat pulled low enough that most folks in town couldn't have described his face if a marshal had asked them to, and a gun belt worn smooth and low on his hip in the manner of men who had used it enough times that the leather had simply given up arguing with the draw. Nobody in Silver City knew his name. The old-timers at the Mercantile had started calling him the Drifter for lack of anything better, and it had stuck the way those things do. He'd ridden out that morning with no particular destination, following a game trail south of town that happened to cut across the corner of Roselyn Cade's land near the spring, meaning to water his horse and move on before the day got hot. And instead, he had come up over the low ridge above the cottonwoods and found himself looking down at 3 men and a boy, and a woman being dragged toward a wagon against her will. He had not planned to be a hero that morning. He had, if the truth of his heart could be laid bare, planned to be nothing at all. A man passing through, unremarked, unremembered, headed nowhere in particular, because nowhere in particular was the only destination left to a man who believed every person he'd ever loved was already dead and buried behind him. But there is something in certain men that does not consult the plan when it sees a woman dragged against her will, something older than any plan. And the Drifter had swung down off his horse at the top of that ridge and started walking toward the yard before he had consciously decided to do any such thing at all. He came down slow, the way a man does when he's already decided how the next 2 minutes are going to go, and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to the decision. Reuben saw him first, still had a fistful of Roselyn's wrist, and made the mistake every Whitlock son had been raised to make. He looked at a stranger without a ranch brand on his horse or a name anybody in the territory recognized and decided the man in front of him didn't matter. "This ain't your business, mister." Reuben didn't even bother to let go of Roselyn's arm. "Right on." The Drifter didn't answer that. He simply kept walking, unhurried, until he was standing near enough that Vern's laugh died somewhere in his throat, and then he said the 3 words that would end up carved, in one form or another, into the memory of everyone standing in that yard for the rest of their lives. "Take your hands off her." There was something in the way he said it, not loud, not a shout, nothing like the bellowing threats the Whitlock men were used to trading among themselves, that made Reuben's grip loosen, almost without his own permission. And when Roselyn Cade, released for just a moment, turned to see who had spoken, and looked up into that shadowed, sun-weathered face beneath the low hat brim, something in her chest folded in on itself, like a paper struck by a match. Because she knew that face. She had spent 12 years telling herself it was buried in a shallow grave outside a burned homestead in Missouri. 12 years grieving a brother she believed the war and its aftermath had swallowed whole. And here it stood, not 10 feet from her, in a New Mexico dooryard, older and harder and marked by things she couldn't yet guess at, but unmistakably. Possibly the same. Wade. The word cracked clean down the middle. The Drifter's pale eyes flicked to her face, for the first time really looked, and whatever iron control had carried him down off that ridge and across the yard nearly broke apart on the spot because he had spent 12 years believing this woman was dead. And the sound of his own name in her voice hit him harder than any bullet he'd taken in all the years since. But that reckoning would have to wait. Reuben Whitlock, recovering his nerve faster than his brain, had his hand dropping toward his pistol, and Vern was already sliding off his horse reaching for his own iron, and the Drifter, Wade, though it would be a long moment yet before either brother learned the name mattered. Turned back to face them with an expression that had gone from something almost tender to something with no temperature in it at all. I'd think on that a good deal longer before I finished the motion. Reuben's hand stopped an inch from his holster. He'd heard men say things like that before. Every two-bit gun hand who ever rode through Silver City liked to talk a big fight, but there was a stillness in the stranger's frame, a coiled economy to how he stood, that told a more honest part of Reuben's brain this was not bluster. And Cletus, still mounted, still holding the deed that had brought them out here in the first place, had gone very quiet, doing what he did best, calculating the angle, weighing the cost, deciding that today might not be the day to press a hand he suddenly wasn't sure they held. You don't know who you're crossing. But Reuben's hand had already come back from his holster, an inch of retreat dressed up as a warning. No, Wade agreed. But I expect you're fixing to tell me, and I expect I won't much care for the answer, so why don't you climb back on those horses and ride yourselves home, and we'll let this be the last conversation any of us ever needs to have about it. It should not have worked. 3 armed men, one of them with a wagon and a deed, and his father's whole ambition riding on this errand, standing down for a single unarmed-looking drifter with no name and no backing. But there is a thing that happens in men who have made a career of bullying the defenseless, faced for the first time with someone who is plainly, calmly, entirely unafraid of them. The courage that felt so solid a moment before turns out to have been built on nothing but other people's fear, and once that fear is gone, Reuben mounted, Vern mounted. Cletus turned his horse without a word, folding the useless deed into his coat, and the 3 of them rode back north toward the Whitlock ranch, with a story that would sound, by the time their father heard it, considerably less humiliating than the truth. But the truth would find Ezra Whitlock soon enough, in the shape of a nameless drifter, standing between his family and the only asset in 3 counties his money hadn't yet managed to buy. Roselyn Cade stood in her own dooryard wrist, throbbing, sun clinging to her skirts, staring at a man she had spent a third of her life mourning as though he might dissolve back into the dust he'd walked out of if she blinked. And Wade, the drifter, the man nobody in Silver City had a name for, stood looking back at her with an expression, 12 years in the making, finally cracking through the mask he'd worn so long. 12 years is a long time to believe your whole family is ash and bone in the ground. It is a long time to build a life around that particular grief, to let it harden into the kind of silence that makes other men call you a ghost before they even know your name. And it was about to be for Wade Cade, though he had ridden under a different name for so long he'd nearly forgotten his own, the shortest 12 years of his life measured against how fast they were about to unravel. Before we ride any further into what happened next, a quick word. Consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button beside the name. It keeps these old stories alive. Now, let's get back to that dooryard, because Roselyn Cade had a great many questions, and the man she'd once called brother had 12 years of silence to answer for. Samuel, the boy, was the one who broke the stillness first, tugging at his mother's skirt and asking, in the plain, unfiltered way of 4-year-olds, why she was crying if the bad men had gone away. Roselyn knelt and gathered him up without taking her eyes off Wade, and it was Wade who crossed the last few feet of dooryard, slow, like a man approaching something he was afraid might still turn out to be a mirage, and knelt down in front of them both. "I thought you were dead," he said, and his voice, that low, flat instrument that had made 3 armed men reconsider their courage, had gone rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with threat. I stood at a grave outside Carthage, with your name on the marker. I put flowers on it every spring I could manage to get back that way. For years, I grieved you, Roselyn. I grieved you like you were the last thing I had left in this world, because I believed you were. The marker was wrong, Roselyn said, and there was a tremor under the words that hadn't fully settled into either grief or joy, still deciding which one it wanted to be. There was a fever that came through the camp that winter. You remember the camp after the house burned, and 3 of us took sick at once, and the woman keeping records got it wrong, wrote my name on the wrong list. I nearly did die, Wade. I was closer to it than any of us wanted to admit at the time, but I didn't. I lived and I looked for you for 2 years after, wrote letters to every fort and way station I could think to try, and then I stopped, because I decided a man doesn't just vanish off the earth unless the earth has taken him. I didn't vanish, Wade said. I ran. There's a difference, and it isn't a flattering one. There, in that dooryard, with the sun climbing toward noon and a dead husband's spring, still running cold and sweet behind the cottonwoods, brother and sister, who had each spent 12 years grieving the other, began haltingly to tell each other the shape of the years in between, though the fuller telling the part that mattered most to what came after. Would wait for a fire that night, because there was a boy watching who did not need to hear all of it yet, and because some griefs are too large to hand over standing in the noon sun, with a wrist still bruised from a stranger's grip. What Roselyn learned that afternoon, in pieces, was this. After the homestead burned and the fever took what the fever took, Wade, 17 years old and half out of his mind with grief he had no name for yet, had drifted into a cavalry unit that didn't ask too many questions about a boy's age if he could sit a horse and shoot straight, and from there into the kind of frontier work that didn't get written up favorably in newspapers, scouting for outfits that weren't particular about the law, riding for men who paid well because decent men wouldn't take the work, killing enough men in enough circumstances that his own name had started to feel like a costume he no longer fit, until he'd simply stopped wearing it. He had not become an outlaw, not exactly. There was no paper on him in any territory, no bounty with his true name attached, but he had become something adjacent to one, a man who solved problems for money in places where the law had given up or never arrived. Hired himself out to hurt someone who hadn't earned it first. He told her some of that first afternoon in the plain, flat voice of a man reciting facts he'd long since stopped feeling much about. What he didn't tell her yet, what he would tell her that night by the fire when Samuel was asleep, was why he had come north through Silver City at all, and it was not, as it happened, entirely by accident. For now, it was enough that a brother had found a sister, that a boy had a silent stranger crouched at his eye level asking his name with more gentleness than the boy had ever heard from a grown man who wasn't his mother, and that somewhere north of that dooryard, 3 Whitlock sons were riding home to a father who did not yet understand what had just ridden into his territory. Ezra Whitlock heard the story of the failed deed signing that evening on his own front porch, delivered by Reuben in the carefully edited version. Sons give fathers when the truth reflects poorly on their nerve, and even in its edited form the story enraged him. A stranger, some nameless drifter with no brand on his horse and no history anyone in town could produce, had stood in a dooryard and told 3 Whitlock sons to turn around, and they had turned around. Ezra Whitlock had built an empire on the principle that his name, once spoken, ended arguments before they began, and the idea that it had failed to end one in his own front yard sat in his gut like a swallowed coal. Find out who he is. Ezra's order fell to Cletus, who was better suited to that particular kind of digging than either of his brothers. I don't care what it costs or who you have to lean on to learn it. A man doesn't ride into this territory from nowhere. Somebody knows him, and there, in fact, was where the second thread of this story, the one that had nothing directly to do with the widow's spring, began to surface. Because Cletus Whitlock, in the course of his usual business moving stolen cattle and unmarked copper through crooked buyers as far as El Paso, answered to men above his father in an arrangement Ezra himself did not fully control. A syndicate out of the copper interests in Santa Fe that had been quietly buying protection from a network of corrupted lawmen across 3 territories, greasing badges the way other men greased wagon axles. Also, the ore moving through their hands never had to answer an honest question about where it came from. And the badge they'd bought cheapest and used hardest sat on the chest of Silver City's own sheriff, a man named Klaus Ammer, who had not enforced an honest law in that town in 4 years and had grown rich enough on Whitlock money to stop pretending otherwise to anyone who mattered. It was Klaus Ammer, in fact, who supplied the first real answer about the stranger, though not the one anyone expected. A wire had come through the territorial marshal's office some weeks prior, the kind of loose, unconfirmed rumor that moves ahead of a dangerous man the way weather moves ahead of a storm, describing a gun hand of considerable reputation. A man some called the silent gun for his habit of never once raising his voice before he ended an argument permanently, a man whose true name nobody seemed to know, but whose work, wherever he passed through, tended to leave crooked outfits considerably poorer. Ammer brought that wire to Ezra Whitlock personally, sweating through his shirt the way a bought lawman sweats when the thing he's bought protection against turns out to be walking around loose in his own jurisdiction. If this is the same man, Ammer's voice had gone thin, you don't want to press this, Ezra. You want to pay the widow full price for that land and forget the spring exists. I have never once in 20 years let a rumor tell me what I want, Ezra said, though something in his own gut had gone tight hearing the description, because a small, buried, honest part of him recognized the shape of a debt he had never quite finished paying. Predated nearly everything he had built his fortune on top of, and he did not say that part out loud to Ammer, not yet. That night, the true accounting began, not at the Whitlock Ranch, but at Roselyn Cade's small fire, where Wade sat across from the sister he'd thought 12 years dead, and finally told her the rest of it, the part that mattered. I didn't come north by accident, he said, once Samuel had finally lost his fight against sleep and been carried to his bed. I've been tracking a man for the better part of 2 years. Not for money, though there's money attached to it now, put up by families who lost more than they could ever get back. I've been tracking Ezra Whitlock. Roselyn went very still. Ezra Whitlock, the man trying to take my spring? The same, Wade said. Before he was a cattle baron in this territory, Roselyn, he was a partner in a mining operation outside Carthage, the very operation that owned the land our house sat on, that we thought was worthless scrub until the war ended. Our father held a legal claim to a portion of that ground, filed proper, that would have made us wealthy on its own merits if it had ever been honored. Whitlock's partners burned 3 homesteads that winter, including ours, to clear disputed claims off the books quiet, and blamed it on raiders who never existed. That's the fire that killed our parents, Roselyn. That's the fire I've spent 12 years believing killed you too." And Ezra Whitlock walked away from Missouri with a portion of the money those claims were worth, moved west, and built himself an empire on land soaked in the ash of families like ours. The fire popped and settled between them, and Roselyn Cade sat with that knowledge settling into her chest, like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading out into every corner of the last 12 years of her life. "You're telling me the man who wants my spring is the same man who burned our home. I'm telling you it's more than that," Wade said. "Whitlock isn't operating alone here, and he never was. His son Cletus moves stolen cattle and copper through a syndicate out of Santa Fe, and that syndicate has bought the local law clean through. Your own sheriff, Klaus Ammer, has been drawing Whitlock money for years to look the other way on everything from rustling to worse. This isn't one greedy old rancher wanting your water, Roselyn. It's a rot that runs from your fence line clear to the territorial capital, and it's the same rot that killed our parents 20 years ago. I came north because I finally traced Whitlock to this territory. I had no earthly idea I was also riding toward you. The two things I've spent the last 12 years hunting turned out, this whole time, to be tangled up in each other." Roselyn was quiet a long moment watching the fire, feeling the shape of a grief she'd carried alone for over a decade suddenly gain a second set of shoulders to help bear it. "Then we finish it together," she said finally. "I am not signing that deed, Wade, and I am not running from this land Daniel died believing would belong to his son. If Whitlock wants a fight over it, I mean to be standing when it's done, not hiding in some cousin's spare room 3 territories over. You won't be standing alone," Wade said. "I should have come to find you the moment I doubted that grave marker. I let 12 years pass, because grief is easier to carry than hope. Some days you stop expecting anything and it stops hurting quite so sharp. I'm not making that mistake twice. Whatever comes for this spring, it comes through me first." It was, though neither of them named it that night by the fire, the beginning of the second half of this story, the part where a woman who had spent 3 years learning to survive on her own terms discovered she did not, in fact, have to keep doing it entirely alone, and a man who had spent 12 years turning himself into a ghost so that grief couldn't find purchase on him, discovered that having something left to protect had a way of making a man solid again. The days that followed moved with the particular tension of a storm gathering just past the horizon, visible but not yet arrived. Wade did not ride on, as a true drifter might have. He took up quiet residence in Roselyn's small barn, mended fence he had no obligation to mend, taught Samuel to whittle a stick into something like a horse, and in the evenings, once the boy was down, taught his sister things she had never had cause to learn in a marriage to a gentle, dying man. How to read the ground for a man's approach before her ears could catch the sound of it, how to keep her hands steady when her heart wanted nothing more than to shake. "I won't always be standing next to you," Wade told her. The first evening he put a rifle in her hands and watched her flinch at the weight of it. "A woman who can only be safe when a man's beside her isn't safe at all, Roselyn. She's borrowing safety. I aim to leave you owning some of your own before this is finished. Whatever happens to me in the doing of it, she was a quicker study than either of them expected." 3 years alone on a hard piece of land, with a small boy to feed, had already taught her a kind of steel most town-raised women never had cause to develop, and it took her only days to go from flinching at the rifle's kick to putting a can off a fence post 4 times in 5 days, to go from trembling at Wade's stories of the Whitlock family's reach to asking, in a voice gone flat and calculating in a way that would have surprised her own late husband, exactly how many men Ezra Whitlock could put in a saddle on short notice. Meanwhile, at the Whitlock ranch, Cletus Whitlock had done the digging his father demanded, and the answer he brought back sat over the family's supper table like a held breath. The drifter was not merely a drifter. Cletus had ridden to Silver City, spent money loosening tongues at the mercantile and the livery, and pieced together enough of the description in that territorial wire, the pale eyes, the low-worn gun belt, the particular economy of a man who never wasted emotion, to become fairly certain the silent gun himself had ridden straight into their family's business and was, at that very moment, teaching their widow neighbor how to shoot. "He's after the copper claims," Ezra said. Once Cletus laid it out plain, and something old and buried in his voice cracked through for just a moment before he clamped it back down. "Somebody's finally sent a collector for Missouri." "You never told us there was anything to collect on from Missouri," Reuben said, frowning, because in the family's telling of its own history, their father's fortune had simply always existed, self-made and self-justified, and the idea that it had a debt attached, a debt with a face and a gun and pale winter eyes, unsettled him in a way 3 armed confrontations never had. There isn't. There's an old business dispute, decades cold, and a man trying to dress up an extortion as justice. I built this ranch with my own hands out of nothing. I will not have some drifter with a reputation walk in here and unmake 20 years of work over a fire that was an accident of the war. Nothing more. But Klaus Ammer, sitting silent at the edge of that supper table, sweating through a second shirt that week, knew an accident of the war did not typically require a man to burn 3 separate homesteads on the same night to clear disputed claims off a ledger. Because saying nothing was the only skill that had kept him wealthy and alive this long in Ezra Whitlock's employ. It was Vern in the end who forced the timeline that neither his father, Vern Whitlock, 24 and drunk on both whiskey and his family's untouchable reputation, could not abide the story now circulating through every saloon and mercantile counter in Silver City. And he rode into town one evening a week after the confrontation, found the man he now knew as the Silent Gun taking a quiet meal at the hotel dining room, and decided, with the particular courage whiskey lends a man right up until the moment it fails him, "You made my brothers look like fools," Burns said loud enough that the whole dining room went silent around them, his hand hovering near his pistol in a way that told every experienced gun hand in the room, "I don't much care what reputation you're carrying. Nobody makes a Whitlock look the fool in this town and rides on breathing." Wade did not stand. He did not reach for his own gun. He simply looked up at Vern Whitlock with those pale winter eyes and said, in the same flat, unhurried voice he'd used in the dooryard a week prior, "Son, I've killed 31 men in my life, and every single one of them made the same mistake you're making right now, which was deciding their pride was worth more than their future. You've got a whole life still in front of you if you turn around and walk out that door, or you've got about 4 seconds of it left if you don't. I'd think hard on which one you'd rather have." The dining room held its breath. Vern Whitlock's hand hovered over his pistol for a long, trembling moment, whiskey courage doing furious battle with the animal instinct. Every man carries somewhere in his gut that recognizes real danger when it's sitting 6 feet away, wearing another man's calm. Vern's hand fell away from his holster. He turned, red-faced, and walked out of that dining room to a silence that would follow him back to the ranch and would, by the time he arrived, have transformed itself in his own retelling into something considerably less humiliating. That was the moment, more than any other, that convinced Ezra Whitlock the matter could not simply be waited out. A man who had backed down 3 of his sons in 2 separate confrontations without drawing a weapon either time was not a man who was going to be discouraged by a lowered price or a stern word from Sheriff Ammer. He was a man who intended to see this through to whatever end he'd ridden north planning, and Ezra Whitlock, cornered by a debt he had spent 20 years pretending did not exist, made the decision that would end his family's reign over that stretch of territory. He sent for every gun he could hire on short notice, not merely his own ranch hands, but riders borrowed from the Copper Syndicate's enforcement arm out of Santa Fe, men who did the syndicate's uglier business when local law wasn't sufficient to the task. Along with Klaus Ammer's 2 deputized cousins who wore badges without troubling themselves to earn them. By the time Ezra Whitlock finished counting, he had assembled 14 armed men, and he gave them a single order for the night 3 days hence. Burn the widow's spring house to the ground, take the boy as leverage if the woman resisted signing anything short of the deed itself, and if the drifter stood in the way, as everyone expected he would, kill him and be done with the whole cursed business once and for all. Word of the gathering reached Wade and Roselyn the way word of such things always eventually does in small territories, through a stable hand at the Whitlock Ranch, who had a cousin working for Roselyn's nearest neighbor, a man with no love for the Whitlocks and a conscience that hadn't entirely calcified despite years drawing their wages. He rode out at dusk 2 days before the planned attack and told them everything: the 14 men, the night chosen, the order to burn and to take the boy if needed. Wade took the news the way he took most things now, with a stillness that had once been armor and had slowly, in the 2 weeks since finding his sister alive, begun turning back into something closer to purpose. 14 men. For the first time since the dooryard, real fear moved across Roselyn's face, not for herself, but for the small boy asleep in the next room. 14 men who've never had to fight for anything in their lives. Money bought their guns. Money didn't buy them courage, and it surely didn't buy them the will to die for Ezra Whitlock Spring. We don't need to beat 14 men in a fair fight, Roselyn. We need to make sure there is no fair fight to be had. What followed were 2 days of preparation that would have looked, to any casual observer, like a small ranch simply battening down for a storm, except that the storm being prepared for arrived on 2 legs and carried Winchesters. Wade dug shallow trip lines across the 2 approaches to the spring house wide enough for a wagon, each one strung to a cluster of cowbells and tin cans that would announce any rider crossing them in the dark, long before that rider ever saw a defender waiting. He rigged the old well cover with a counterweight that could drop a section of the yard's flooring into a shallow pit, lined with sharpened stakes. Not deep enough to kill a man outright, but more than deep enough to break a leg and take him permanently out of a fight. Watching him build it had trouble finding the seam afterward. He positioned 3 half-empty barrels of lamp oil at choke points around the spring house, not to burn the building his sister and nephew called home, but to create a wall of sudden fire that could turn a line of advancing riders into a scattering. And he taught Roselyn, over those same 2 days, to hold a position at the loft window with a rifle and the particular cold patience it took to wait and wait and wait, and only fire when a target was certain. "I won't ask you to kill a man unless there's no other way through it," Wade told her the final night. checking the load on the rifle she now handled without flinching. "But I need you to understand, there may not be another way through it, before it comes to that. And I need to know you can do what needs doing if it does. Not for me." "I buried a husband already," Roselyn said, and her voice had none of the tremor it had carried 2 weeks prior. "I am not burying a son to a man's greed over a piece of water. Whatever needs doing, Wade, I will do it." The night the 14 riders came was moonless, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and shape alike, and Ezra Whitlock rode at the rear of his own hired army with Klaus Ammer beside him, having decided in the end that a matter this personal required his own presence to see it properly finished. Reuben and Cletus rode with the main body. Vern, still smarting from his humiliation in the hotel dining room, had begged to ride at the front, and his father, in the one true mistake of that entire miserable campaign, had allowed it. The first trip line caught 2 riders on the eastern approach, cowbells clattering explosive and sudden in the dark, and the panic that noise caused among men already tense as drawn wire was worth more than any bullet. 3 horses reared, 1 rider was thrown clean. Shouting knot of men trying to figure out whether they were under fire before anyone had actually fired a shot. On the western approach, where Vern rode eager at the front of 6 men, the ground gave way beneath his own horse first, the counterweighted trap dropping man and animal both into the shallow stake pit with a scream that cut through the dark and turned 6 eager riders into 6 men suddenly unwilling to advance another foot into ground that might swallow any of them next. Wade came up out of the dark near the spring house itself, moving the way Roselyn had watched him move that first morning in her dooryard, unhurried, economical, a man who had made his peace with violence so long ago that it no longer cost him anything to enact it, only to have caused it necessary in the first place. He put a struck match to the nearest oil barrel, and a wall of sudden orange flame roared up between 2 advancing riders and the spring house itself, close enough to singe eyebrows and far enough to kill no one, and in the flame's brief violent light he put 2 clean shots into the shoulders of the men nearest the fire, disabling rather than ending, the way he'd promised himself 20 years ago he would fight if he ever got the chance to fight for something worth the restraint. From the loft window, Roselyn Cade watched Klaus Ammer's deputized cousin, one of the 2 men who'd ridden in wearing a badge they had never troubled to earn, level a rifle at the spring house window where she knelt, clearly having spotted movement. She breathed out the way he'd shown her and put a single round through the man's shoulder before his own rifle ever cleared level, and watched him drop his weapon and clutch the wound and stumble backward into the dark, and felt something inside her that was not quite triumph and not quite horror. The particular feeling of a woman who has discovered, at considerable cost, that she is not as helpless as the world had spent 3 years insisting she was. The battle, if it could even be called that, against men whose courage evaporated the moment the ground itself seemed to turn against them, lasted less than 20 minutes before what remained of Ezra Whitlock's hired army broke into full retreat, dragging their wounded, abandoning 2 horses that had bolted into the dark, leaving Vern still trapped and screaming in the stake pit until his own brothers, shamed into it, came back under a white handkerchief to haul him out. Which left, in the end, only Ezra Whitlock himself, standing alone in the yard he had sent 14 men to burn, his hired army scattered into the New Mexico dark, facing a single drifter walking toward him out of the dying light of a barrel fire with a gun holstered. "You're the collector," Ezra said, and his voice, that voice which had ended arguments in that territory for 20 years, simply by being spoken, had gone thin and old in a way none of his sons had ever heard it. The one they sent for Missouri, nobody sent me, Wade said. I sent myself, the day I finally stopped believing the fire that killed my parents was an accident of the war. My name was Cade before I let it stop mattering. My father held legal claim to copper ground your partners burned 3 families to clear off the books. One of those families was mine. I have spent 12 years finding every man who had a hand in that fire, Ezra, and you are the last one standing. Ezra Whitlock's face in the dying firelight went through something like 20 years of buried guilt surfacing all at once. And for a moment, just a moment, the ruthless old man who had built an empire on other families' ashes looked simply old and frightened and cornered by a debt he had spent 2 decades pretending did not exist. I'll give you anything. Land money. Whatever the claim was worth, 10-fold more. I don't want your money, Wade said. I never did. I want the truth in front of a territorial judge, and I want every crooked badge your syndicate has bought, starting with the one on Klaus Ammer's chest, stripped and answered for. That's the debt, Ezra, not gold. The truth, finally, out loud in a courtroom where it can't be bought back into silence. It was Roselyn, though, climbing down from the loft with the rifle still steady in her hands, walking out into that yard to stand beside the brother she'd thought dead for 12 years, who delivered the final piece of justice that night. Because it was Ezra Whitlock's hand that had signed the papers 3 years prior, forcing her late husband's family off a scrap of Missouri claim decades before the last surviving thread, connecting the fire that killed her parents to the man now standing, broken in her own dooryard. Seeing his entire bought existence collapsing in the firelight, drew a hideout pistol from his boot and leveled it at Wade's back. It was Roselyn Cade, widow, mother, a woman who 3 weeks prior had never fired a rifle in her life, who put the round through Klaus Ammer's chest before his own shot ever left the barrel, and watched the corrupt sheriff who had sold this territory's law to the highest bidder for 4 straight years drop dead in the dirt at her feet. She did not shake after she had expected to. She stood instead, with the rifle still raised, breathing hard, watching the man fall, and felt the particular cold clarity of a woman who has just discovered exactly how much she was capable of when her son's future required it of her. He would have shot you in the back, she said to Wade when he turned. When the two of them stood in the yard amid the wreckage of Ezra Whitlock's broken siege, the fire dying down to embers, Vern still weeping somewhere in the dark over his ruined leg. Ezra himself, sitting now in the dirt where his knees had finally given out under the weight of 20 years, finally come due. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to you. Not after 12 years of thinking I'd already lost you. No, Wade said, and something in his flat, careful voice cracked open at last, 12 years of armor finally coming apart in his own sister's dooryard. I don't suppose you were. The territorial marshal arrived from Silver City 2 days later, summoned by a rider Wade had sent the very morning after the siege, carrying with him a satchel of documents. Wade had spent 2 years assembling ledgers, testimony from families in 3 territories who had lost land and kin to the same syndicate. Sworn statements, finally willing to be given now that the local corruption, enforcing silence, had been broken in a single night. Ezra Whitlock, stripped of his hired guns and his bought sheriff both, did not resist the marshal's questions the way he might once have. Something in him had simply stopped fighting the night. His empire's foundation walked back out of his own buried past, and stood in a dooryard reciting the truth he'd spent 20 years paying men to keep silent. The territorial court that convened in Silver City that summer was a smaller, quieter affair than the crime itself deserved, but it was enough. Ezra Whitlock's claim to the disputed Missouri copper ground was voided outright, the proceeds ordered distributed among the surviving families whose homesteads had burned that long-ago winter, Wade's own restored inheritance among them, though he asked that his share go instead toward a fund for Silver City's orphaned and widowed, having long since decided he had no use for money that traced back to that particular fire. The syndicate's protection network, exposed by the very ledgers Wade had spent 2 years compiling, collapsed under a wave of federal attention that reached considerably further than Klaus Ammer's grave. Reuben and Cletus Whitlock, unable to produce a single honest defense for the family's cattle and copper smuggling once the books were opened, took plea terms that sent them to territorial prison for a stretch of years long enough to end any hope of resuming the family's old business when they emerged. Vern, his leg permanently ruined by the stake pit, walked with a cane for the remainder of his days, and never again, according to the few who still spoke of him in Silver City, tried to draw a weapon on a stranger in a hotel dining room. And Ezra Whitlock himself, old and broken and stripped of everything but the ash his fortune had always secretly been built from, was permitted by the court, in a small mercy nobody quite understood the reasoning behind, except perhaps Wade himself, to live out his remaining years on a reduced parcel of his former ranch, and forbidden from ever again holding land or livestock beyond what he needed simply to survive, a sentence that struck some in Silver City as too gentle for a man who'd ordered 3 homesteads burned and 14 armed men against a widow's spring. Killing him wouldn't have given my parents back their lives. It wouldn't have given Roselyn back the 12 years we lost believing each other dead. All that's left to do with a debt like that is make sure the truth outlives the man who tried to bury it, and let him spend what's left of his own life sitting inside the wreckage he built. That's a harder sentence than a bullet. In the end, I've seen enough men die easy. I wanted this one to have to keep living with it. Cade's spring, Roselyn had begun using the old name again, the one from the original survey maps. The name her late husband had been so proud to file, ran clear and cold through that whole long summer, same as it always had, but its water served a different purpose now. Roselyn, with Wade's help and the first real security she'd known since Daniel's death, opened the spring to travelers passing through that stretch of territory, built a simple way station at the crossing where the road met the water, charged nothing to anyone too poor to pay, and a fair small toll to those who could. And within a year had turned the one asset every powerful man in 3 counties had once tried to steal from her into something that belonged in the truest sense to the whole territory. Wade stayed through that summer, and through the following winter, mending fence and teaching Samuel to sit a horse properly, and in the quiet evenings, finally telling his sister the fuller accounting of the 12 years he'd spent believing himself alone in the world. Not all of it easy to hear, not all of it easy to tell, but told anyway, because a man who has spent over a decade as a ghost discovers, once he's given a reason to be solid again, that he does not much care to go back to being smoke. But a man who has spent that many years hunting deaths does not, in the end, stay settled easily. And, by the spring following the siege, Wade had begun to feel the old restlessness stirring again. Not the restlessness of a man running from his grief this time, but something gentler. The simple truth that there were still families in 3 territories whose own fires had never been properly answered for, still ledgers he'd promised in the quiet corners of his 2-year hunt to see through to the end for people who had no drifter of their own to send. "You don't have to go," Roselyn told him. The morning he finally saddled his horse for good, Samuel clinging to his leg in a way that made the leaving considerably harder than it needed to be. "You have a home here now." "I know it," Wade said, "and I mean to come back to it every chance the road allows me. But I spent 12 years believing I had nothing left worth protecting. Roselyn, and I was wrong about that in the worst way a man can be wrong. I don't aim to spend what's left of my life pretending the world doesn't have other families still waiting on somebody to finally settle their accounts. You taught me that, standing in that loft window with a rifle you'd never fired 2 weeks before. A person doesn't have to stay helpless just because the world decided they should be. Somewhere out there's a family that needs to learn that same lesson, same as you did. I mean to keep teaching it, long as I've got the years left to do it in." He rode out that morning the same unhurried way he'd ridden in 3 seasons before, and Roselyn Cade stood in her own dooryard, the same dooryard where 3 armed men had once dragged her toward a wagon believing her helpless. Patient ache of a woman who has learned the difference between losing someone and simply letting them go, do the work only they can do, trusting the road to bring them back around in its own time. Now, partner, I've told a good many stories around a good many fires in my years, and I'll tell you plain, the ones that stick with a man longest aren't the ones where the villain dies loudest or the guns fire fastest. They're the ones where somebody discovers, usually against every expectation the world has trained into them, that they were never as alone or as helpless as the hard years had convinced them they were. Roselyn Cade spent 3 years believing survival meant doing everything herself and asking for nothing. Right up until the morning, a ghost from her own past walked back down out of a ridge to remind her that some debts, the good kind, the kind built on love instead of greed, are worth letting someone else help you carry. And Wade Cade spent 12 years believing a man with nothing left to lose was somehow safer than a man with something worth protecting, until a dooryard full of danger taught him the opposite was true the whole time. Your past may explain the shape you've grown into, folks, but it does not have to define the shape you choose to grow toward next. Keep that in your pocket next time the world tries to convince you otherwise. Before you go, 2 small asks, if this old story earned them. First, consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button right beside the name up top. It goes a long way. Second, and always, like this video. Subscribe if you're new around this fire, and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because I do treasure knowing how far these old tales travel to reach you. This story, like all the ones we tell here, is a work of fiction inspired by the folklore and legend of the old frontier, brought to you with the help of some modern storytelling tools, but built, same as always, on the oldest truth the West ever taught anybody, that justice is patient, that family finds its way home by roads nobody could have predicted, and that a debt owed to the innocent always eventually comes due. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your soul a little more honest than the men who tried to take that spring.